Roanoke has a very rich railroad history, and I think this museum helps to preserve that and to show the public what the railroads meant to the economy at the time. And people come here really from all over the world because they admire the Norfolk and Western and especially its steam locomotives.
But it's unfathomable that here we are, the official transportation museum of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the keepers of the 611 and the 1218, two of the most magnificent steam engines ever built, and we're not even in the state budget. And I just find that unconscionable.
We have 3 Murphys that live in the museum, and we know one of them will appear each day. Some days all 3 of them appear, and consequently it's a challenge just to run the place, but it's also a great deal of fun, and there's nothing that we can't do if we don't try hard enough.
While the Virginia Museum of Transportation documents the history of transportation, it also depicts the city of Roanoke's origins. When the Shenandoah Valley Railroad intersected with the Norfolk and Western at the city, it created a population explosion. In 1881, there were 300 residents. Nearly 1 year later, that number jumped to 3,500. Hello, I'm Denise Allen Membrano. In the next half hour, Cox Communications is looking back at the history of the Virginia Museum of Transportation. The Virginia Museum of Transportation got its start in the early 1960s under a different name and with different owners. Back then, it was just a seasonal attraction.
Arthur Owens, who was probably the most beloved city manager that Roanoke has ever had, understood intuitively the connection between the railroad and the city. And he asked the railroad for a locomotive, number 6, which sits out in the back of the museum to this day. And they put it in Wasena Park, put an anchor fence around it so you could look at it, but you couldn't touch it. And then later they put a fire truck next to it with another anchor fence around it. And for a while, you know, that was all that there really was. And I guess back in the early 60s, the idea came out that maybe there should be more of an attempt at doing a real transportation museum. And a committee was formed, and Jim Trout, who was not on council at that time, but a JC, was the chairman of it, and I got put on it when I was 15 years old. We had people from trucking companies and the railroad and all kinds of different transportation-related things.
The city got behind the effort of the JCs and other citizens to create what was then called the Roanoke Transportation Museum. Roanoke City constructed the first museum at Wasena Park.
The city got behind it, and they literally were the owners of it. And they built a concrete entrance and a building that had kind of a shed roof, all done out of pre-stressed concrete. And they had, you know, carriages and automobiles and trucks underneath that. And that's when they brought 611 in. They figured out it was the last steam locomotive left in Roanoke and left on the Norfolk and Western. And that was, I think, probably what keyed it off, was being able to get 611. And it stayed that way for a long time. The garden clubs came in and did beautiful flowers around it. And it was a park-like setting, which was very unusual for a transportation museum, and everybody liked it. And I worked there 2 summers as the superintendent, as an employee of the Parks and Recreation Department. I would clean them and work on them. And, you know, it was really neat. The first year we had people from 24 states. The second year from 32 states, because we kept a record of it. And they were coming to see 611. That's all that was really there for these people to see. And so you immediately knew there is a big pull here. how do we take this and capture it and really begin to use it to benefit the Roanoke Valley.
The Roanoke Transportation Museum continued to operate that way until 1976, when the city closed the museum and the Mill Mountain Zoo because city leaders said it could no longer afford to operate the attractions.
John Turbyfield, who was executive vice president of the Norfolk and Western at the time, said we've got to have a transportation museum in Roanoke. And he worked with the chamber and their foundation and got the board enlarged. We had lots of contractors and insurance people, and they built the station that's now in Wasena Park, so that for the very first time there was display space for historical items. And there was also a huge model railroad train, HO scale, in that building that people could walk around. They couldn't get in the middle of it, but they could walk around and see it. Well, with that came a whole new level of attendance. It got up in the 50,000 range. We got more rail equipment. We had some airplanes, and there used to be even a lake over there that had a couple of boats. They didn't float, they just sat on these racks that were in the bottom. But it became, probably one of the premier transportation museums on the East Coast at that time.
That was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. During that time, the museum hosted several special events each month. Bev Fitzpatrick became president of the Roanoke Transportation Museum in 1984 and saw the need for a new home for the museum.
And immediately wrote to the members of the board and the members of the museum, because we're a membership organization, and said, we've had 2 floods here. We really haven't been taken out yet, but some of us are really worried about it. What would you all think about us looking at an alternative? 86% of the members said, let's look at some other alternative. I appointed a committee, and a guy named Jim Molinary, who runs the rail yard here in Roanoke, was the chairman. And we went all over looking at where we could be. Most places that had rail were in the floodplain. But we selected this building because we thought, first of all, it's out of the floodplain, it's next to the railroad, and it would be a great place to go. So in December, when Mr. Clater came back to Roanoke for the holidays, after Norfolk Southern was just formed in '82, we went to him and asked for this building. We didn't hear anything, and we were certainly not going to try to push on him. And in October, about 2 weeks after I had left the presidency, the flood happened, on Election Day. And the museum was totally destroyed. We think it's the only museum to ever be totally destroyed like this by a natural disaster in the United States. Some have suffered damage, but not just destruction.
After the flood, Norfolk Southern gave the museum part of the building. Dire circumstances brought the Transportation Museum to the perfect location.
This building was the glue for the whole community, because everything that came in and out of Roanoke went through this building. It came in by rail on one side and went out by truck on the other side.
The flood of 1985 nearly wiped out the museum. Floodwaters roared into Wasena Park and sent museum officials searching for higher ground. They found it in an old freight station, one of the most important buildings in the Roanoke Valley in the early 1900s.
Well, this was the local freight station, the office of the local freight agent. It was the point where, the location where less than carload shipments of freight were handled from local industries and from surrounding towns that would bring the freight in here by truck and unload at the docks, and the cargo would be transferred into rail cars for further movement. And there were 5 or 6 tracks serving the station here that would accommodate less than carload freight cars. They would be loaded during the day for various destinations. For example, you'd have a car going to Lynchburg or one to Norfolk or Winston-Salem. One end of the northeast corner of the building was housed the Shenandoah Division Superintendent's office and his staff. The Shenandoah Division was the part of the railroad that extended from Hagerstown, Maryland, through Roanoke to Winston-Salem.
This has been the perfect place to be. Not only is it an original railroad building that had a lot to do with the history of the Roanoke Valley, because everything that came in the way of freight back in those days came in boxcars, came in the doors, behind you, and rail cars, and went out the front in trucks. And there was no interstate. Your automobiles came in boxcars, your washers and dryers and everything else came in boxcars. And so this was the focal point of the interaction with people for the whole region. Because it has high ceilings, we can display things in a very unique way. We can do everything from airplanes to cars, and of course the trains are out back.
The old building does present some challenges. The Virginia Museum of Transportation is the only museum in the Roanoke Valley that has not been renovated. Some of the electrical circuits are decades old. There is no central heating and air conditioning. The building is extremely expensive to heat and cool because it has no insulation.
Opened in 1918, and it still has a lot of the original stuff in it from 1918. The whole building could use an overhaul. All the windows need to be fixed, the doors need to be fixed, the electric needs to be fixed. It's just an overall major redo would be nice.
In 1976, a 501c3, which is a charitable organization, was founded to run it. We still, are that same organization. We changed our name from the Roanoke Transportation Museum to the Virginia Museum of Transportation, and got the General Assembly to designate us as the official Transportation Museum of the Commonwealth of Virginia. But we, through the graciousness of Norfolk Southern, own this building and most of the land behind it. We do lease some land from the railroad at the very end towards their tracks in case they ever need that space. But we operate really as an independent corporation. Occasionally we get state funds, occasionally we get money from the city, but no one supports us like they support other museums, and that's one of the things that we want to get to a more equitable point in time.
The Virginia Museum of Transportation is designated a state museum, but it is not operated by the state. A meager operating budget has hindered the museum's growth. Director Bev Fitzpatrick feels the museum has a strong foundation on which to grow. The 611 and 1218 steam locomotives are world famous, and another exhibit, this Jupiter rocket, has become a Roanoke landmark.
The United States Air Force donated the 67-foot-tall Jupiter rocket to Roanoke in 1965. It weighs 11 tons. The Jupiter was the United States' first intermediate-range ballistic missile. It was also used for suborbital test flights. Its most famous flight was on May 29, 1959, when an American rhesus monkey and a South American squirrel monkey cruised to an altitude of 360 miles at a top speed of 10,000 miles per hour. The Jupiter rocket lifted off from Wasena Park to its current location next to the Transportation Museum in January 1997. The Auto Gallery holds a few personal memories for Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick's father, Judge Beverly Fitzpatrick, had a pet name for his yellow Studebaker. Volunteer Phil McFarland talked Fitzpatrick's mother into loaning the car to the museum.
Won't give it to me, but she loaned it to us. So, you just, every day you try to do something a little different. This one right here. That's precious right there. We don't know why the judge called it precious, but he did.
The Auto Gallery is sponsored by Advance Auto and the Virginia Department of Transportation. Around the perimeter of the room is a documentary of the last 100 years of VDOT. Help is needed to complete the exhibit by repairing some dioramas.
We rescued them from a building in Richmond that was going to be torn down. And we went and picked them up, but they're so old and the mechanics on them are so different that we need somebody to come in who is really good with their hands and mechanically inclined. And we have a little bit of money we raised to pay them to get these fixed and get them out here in the Auto Gallery because they're fascinating. I mean, they've got a snowplow that's pushing snow, and that means that one lane of the thing is a belt going one way and the truck's going the other, and then behind it the scenery's moving at the same time, and it looks like a real live picture almost.
All visitors to the museum have a connection to transportation.
I think if they were to come down here, especially if they bring their family members down here, they're going to find a connection here. They're going to have a grandparent that rode on one of these trains, or they're going to have someone who has a story about a streetcar, or in the auto gallery they're going to see a car in there that reminds them of a relative's car or of their first car, their first experience. You're going to find a lot of personal stories here and things that you can relate to directly, you know. And here again, you know, we take it for granted, but if you bring your family down, you come down here and you enjoy this place, take a bit of it home with you and really spend some time. The African American exhibit in there speaks to the African Americans that worked on the rail here locally. That's a fascinating tape in there. It's a great program. We have a lot of pictorial displays in there that, you know, a lot of people, local people, find family members all the time in these photographs that are down here. So I think the personal connection is something that people would be surprised at.
In 1996, the museum and Roanoke City announced plans for another way to connect with potential visitors to the Transportation Museum and highlight Roanoke's history as well. The Rail Walk has evolved over the years.
Thanks to folks like Mary Ann Ward at Virginia Scrap Iron, who gave us 92,000 pounds of steam locomotive wheels, an incredible city staff that did the fabrication for the plaques, and some railroad folks here that we contracted with to do the information, it wouldn't be what it is. But now it's the only one of its kind in America. It's the only place that you can walk along a section of rail with moving trains and read about that rail and its impact on a community. And furthermore, it's the only place that has a horn that you can blow and a bell you can ring and crossing gate that goes up and down, and kids love to have participatory things. It is almost a mirror image of what we want this museum to ultimately become, all of which is geared to Roanoke being an experience where you can go to the Link Museum and you can see the incredible work of Winston Link. You can come over the bridge and get on the rail walk and learn more as you come up the rail walk, and it puts you at the front door of the Virginia Museum of Transportation, where you can see and touch the real thing.
Still, the 611 and 1218 remain the bread and butter of the museum. Visitors from more than 45 countries and just as many states came to the museum in 2008.
We had a gentleman from Canberra, Australia, email us last fall that he said, I understand the two locomotives that I want to come see are not in the museum. And they weren't. They were at the shops for the 125th anniversary of the Roanoke shops. And he said, I've canceled my trip. Would you let me know when they're coming back? And I'll come reschedule my trip and come to Roanoke. Well, we did. And he came all the way from Australia to see 611 and 1218. I think that what that tells us is we have both a national and international following, but we are not yet able to create the sizzle that goes with the steak that brings the volume that Roanoke deserves and that this museum can certainly provide to if we do some more.
Louis Newton knows firsthand why the 611 attracts visitors from all over the world. He worked at Norfolk and Western for 37 years and has spent his retirement writing about his experiences in his series of Rails Remembered books.
Well, I'd been working about a month as a special apprentice. I was at Schaefer's Crossing at the Roundhouse. And the 611 was turned out of Roanoke shops on May the 29th, 1950. And it came to Schaefer's Crossing to get a full supply of coal and water and sand. And I helped put the first load of sand in its domes. And I thought it was one of the most beautiful pieces of machinery I'd ever seen. And locomotives such as the 611, the Class J's, were not only beautiful, but they were very powerful and fast, and became kind of a legend in the steam locomotive era.
In documenting the history of transportation, the Virginia Museum of Transportation is documenting the beginnings of Roanoke as well. In the early years, the city of Roanoke had a symbiotic relationship with the railroad. As the railroad prospered, so did the city. Members of the Norfolk and Western Historical Society have gathered an extensive archive. They have preserved papers from the early years of the railroad, such as handwritten business ledgers and locomotive schematics drawn on linen.
In 1999, the Norfolk and Western Historical Society acquired the 7,400 square foot building on Salem Avenue in Roanoke, Virginia. The Society quickly filled the building with 56,000 drawings of N&W and Virginian Railway equipment. One of the oldest drawings dates back to the late 1800s and is older than the city of Roanoke. There are N&W annual reports dating from 1888 through 1981. Over the years, the Society has collected more than 10,000 photographic images of N&W and the Virginian. These include the steam era as well as diesel power. The N&W Historical Society is currently working to digitize the collection to make it available to rail fans all over the world. The Virginia Museum of Transportation operates with 5 full-time and 3 part-time employees and a slew of volunteers. This model train layout of the Roanoke Valley was built by volunteers. The Auto Gallery is an example of the impact volunteers have on the museum.
And this is Phil McFarland's room. He's done so much of this. It would never be done without him. And so the volunteers are the most crucial element in us not only staying alive, but in being able to improve every day something and to add it as time goes on to the collection and to the interpretation of the collection.
Well, I was asked to come up and fix a couple things, and I noticed the first time I came up, it was just a little simple repair of a unit that wasn't working properly anymore. And then I was asked to work on the exit signs to replace those. And as I was doing that, I just kind of looked around and saw how things were being done, and I just decided that these people need some help. So I originally was only going to volunteer like a day a week. Well, it got to the point where you couldn't get things done in a day's time, so it became a couple days, and it came 2 or 3 days, and then the maintenance man left, and they didn't have a maintenance man anymore, and it just slowly evolved into I'm here most of the time now.
I work in the retail shop, the gift shop, and it was originally 1 day a week, but it sort of evolved automatically into 2 days because between Labor Day and Memorial Day, we're closed on Mondays, so I was helping out in different ways, all different kinds of projects going on here. And then when the museum opened on the following Memorial Day, well, they said, gee, aren't you going to work here in the shop on Mondays? It just sort of followed naturally.
A friend of mine, Robert Bennett, asked me to get involved with the museum down here with him, and so I've been down here ever since.
So what has your involvement been?
Everything from just starting as a grassroots volunteer, just coming in and spending some time helping with various functions and things of that nature, to being a participant on the board of directors, to becoming a member of the executive committee, and then I've been president here for the past 2.5 years, and I gave that position over to Mr. Ken Lanford, effective July 1.
Director Fitzpatrick started volunteering at the museum when he was appointed to the board at the age of 15.
Greatest part about it at the time was I was at Patrick Henry High School, and I had to leave school to go to meetings. They were during school, and I got to get out of school. I thought that was wonderful.
Over the years, Fitzpatrick volunteered with the museum in many capacities. He was a consultant to the museum in July 2006 when Mother Nature would again wreak havoc. A freak windstorm blew off the museum's roof, causing an estimated $200,000 in damages. Debris from the museum was found 2 blocks away. The museum had to close for a month during its busiest season.
I came down with an agreement to work for 6 months to try to see what was going on, see what I could help them do and whatever. And about 2 weeks later, the roof blew off in the storm. And about a week later, I went to a board meeting one afternoon and they said, "You're the new executive director." So it happened really quick, and I didn't ask for it. I didn't, but I think the one thing, again, I'm not a museum professional, and there will come a time when this museum needs that kind of person. They can't afford it right now, and I don't know of anybody who'd want to take the job until we get it fixed, if you will. But in many ways, I've probably forgotten more than most people know about the museum. And so I have an institutional memory, which I think is very helpful. And the board has been extremely supportive of me so far, and I hope they will continue to be, because we're really facing some critical issues. I mean, we were having a really tough time getting through the very first year that I came. We weren't even sure we were going to get through it, and we did, with wonderful people giving us support when we desperately needed it. We're going to have a tough time this year because the governor had to cut non-state agency budgets, and we started off this year $150,000 in the hole.
They love the museum, they love the artifacts, they love 1218 and 611, but they take it for granted. They think, oh, well, it's going to be there. It's the Virginia Museum of Transportation. Certainly the state is footing the bills and keeping it, and everybody's just mismanaging the money. Well, that's not true. Bottom line is, the community has to support this museum, and the state has to support this museum, and all the patrons and all of the aficionados, they have to support this museum. We all have to come together as a community and determine, you know what, if we don't get involved and we don't do something, it won't be here for our children.
You know, what we would like to do is, when you walk in the cab of 611 or 1218, we'd like to have the fire blocks glowing orange. We'd like to have smoke or steam coming out of the pistons so that it feels like that engine is alive. Nobody does that in the country that I'm aware of. That's the kind of thing we need to begin to do. And then if you have a mannequin in the engineer's seat and a mannequin in the fireman's seat, and there's a narrative of them talking together about how fast they went last week between Petersburg and Norfolk at 110 miles an hour, then it begins to audibly interpret the history of Roanoke, the history of Virginia's rail heritage in a much different way than we can afford to do it now.
Once you come here, it really does change your whole perspective. It changes from, well, just another place to go or something to do, to a place that has an important part in the history of Roanoke. And so it really is a piece of the life of this town.
Norfolk Southern has extended a $1 million grant to the Virginia Museum of Transportation on the condition that the museum raises $1 million from area governments and another $1 million from the private sector.
The future of the Virginia Museum of Transportation is in the hands of local governments, the state, and the people who would like to continue to have the opportunity to touch history. I'm Denise Allen Membrano. Thank you for joining Cox Communications and looking back at the history of the Virginia Museum of Transportation.